He always wondered what it meant when people said the past had a way of calling you back, but he never expected the call to arrive in the form of a brittle envelope tucked beneath a chipped coffee mug at the shelter, an envelope that held nothing but a hand-drawn map and his grandmother's trembling signature. It arrived on a gray autumn morning when the air felt thin, when the world seemed to speak in cold whispers rather than words, and when the weight of homelessness pressed so tightly on his chest that even breathing felt like a daily negotiation. He had spent months pretending the world wasn't collapsing around him, months telling his young son, Ethan, that everything would somehow work out, months praying in half-broken sentences that God still saw them, even if no one else did. The map was the last thing he expected, strange, cryptic, ink-faded, showing mountain ridges and a single unmarked trail leading to something circled 3 times. No explanation, no message, no context. Just a map that seemed to say, "Come find me." At first, he wanted to throw it away, telling himself it was pointless, that his grandmother had been gone for years, that nothing good waited for him in the mountains where she once lived alone and quiet, tucked away from the world. But then he looked at Ethan, curled against his side, small hands clutching the one toy he managed to save through all their chaos, and something inside him cracked. A realization or a surrender? He wasn't sure. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the journey itself would force life to shift, even if just slightly. So he folded the map, tucked it into his jacket, and told Ethan they were going on a little adventure. The boy had looked up with tired eyes, but offered a smile, a tiny, fragile smile, but enough to remind him that even cracked things could shine in the right light. They left the shelter. That evening, slipping through the outskirts of town as the autumn wind pushed leaves across the pavement, like restless messengers. The sun dipped behind the buildings, turning the world into a muted painting of rust, gold, and dying green. Their footsteps were soft. Their breaths clouded the air. He kept one hand on Ethan's shoulder and the other on the map in his pocket, as if touching it would keep doubts from growing too loud. The road out of town felt longer than he remembered from childhood memories, the kind blurred by time and softened by nostalgia. But each step carried a strange electricity, a quiet feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of reality. They passed fences leaning into the wind, fields dry and mottled with the scent of distant rain, and an abandoned gas station that flickered with a single dying bulb. Ethan asked where they were going, and he answered honestly, "I'm not sure, but your great-grandma wanted us to see something." The boy nodded, as if that answer wasn't strange at all, as if this were all part of some grand story he trusted implicitly. And maybe that was what kept them walking, even when the sky turned steel gray and the wind curled cold fingers around their jackets. By the time they reached the foothills, evening had melted into deep night with only the muted moon lighting their path. He set up a small camp beneath a cluster of pine trees, using old gear he hadn't touched in years. Ethan fell asleep quickly, worn from walking, head resting on his father's lap. There in the silence, he looked at the map again, tracing the lines with the tip of his finger. It didn't make sense. It wasn't made by any surveyor or cartographer. It was too personal, too intentional, almost like a whisper disguised as ink. Why would she leave this for him? Why now, when life had stripped him so bare he barely recognized himself. He whispered a quiet prayer, thanking God for giving them at least a direction. Not a solution yet, but a direction. And even that felt like mercy. When dawn broke, color flooded the trees in slow gradients of copper and honey. The mountains rose in the distance, looming like ancient guardians watching their every move. He nudged Ethan awake, and together they pressed forward, following the map's narrow trail into the woods. The path was subtle, a suggestion more than a trail, but the markings matched the map perfectly. As they walked, the forest shifted from familiar to strange. Branches arched overhead, forming natural tunnels of orange and gold. Leaves floated down, brushing their jackets like soft hands. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of leaves, the whisper of wind, the occasional call of a distant bird. It was beautiful, but eerie, as if the forest carried secrets too heavy to speak aloud. Yet there was peace in the quiet, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not bright or loud, but a quiet ember warming the edges of his chest. Ethan asked questions as they walked: who made the map, what they might find, whether his great-grandma had been nice. He answered as best as he could, telling stories he half remembered about a woman who was both gentle and fierce, who believed the world always held hidden wonders. The more he talked, the more real she felt again, like she was walking beside them. By midday, they reached a clearing he didn't recognize. The map led them straight through it, past a fallen log covered in bright moss, toward a ridge where the ground dipped sharply downward. He took Ethan's hand and led him carefully along the descent, until the trees parted and revealed a narrow valley carving through the mountain. There, partially hidden between stone and shadow, was something unexpected. An old wooden post standing crooked at the valley entrance, a red cloth tied around it. The same cloth drawn on the map with a tiny, faded X. His breath caught. This was real. She meant for him to find this. His grandmother had planned it. He stepped closer, running his fingers over the weathered wood. It felt warm from the sun despite the cold air around them. Ethan tugged on his sleeve, pointing deeper into the valley. "Dad, look." And then he saw it, what he thought must be the beginning of the tunnel. At first, it didn't even look like an entrance, just a dark slit between boulders, easy to dismiss. But the map's final markings curved toward it. A chill ran through him, not from fear, but from recognition. Somehow he knew they were meant to go inside. Yet he hesitated, listening to the wind as it brushed past the stones. It carried the faint scent of earth, old and deep. He could almost imagine his grandmother whispering, urging him on. But why a tunnel? Why lead him here? What was buried beneath the mountain that she believed he needed? He crouched beside Ethan, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Whatever's in there, we go together. You stay right behind me, okay?" Ethan nodded, gripping his father's jacket tightly. Inside, the entrance was narrower than it looked. They squeezed through, brushing against cool stone until they emerged into a passage tall enough to stand. Their footsteps echoed softly, merging with the faint dripping sound somewhere deep inside. Shafts of light cut through cracks above, scattering dust in shimmering patterns. It felt ancient, alive, like stepping into the memory of the mountain itself. He moved slowly, guiding Ethan carefully, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. Every part of him trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that he was standing on the threshold of something monumental, something meant specifically for him. The deeper they went, the colder the air grew. The walls glistened with moisture. Roots dangled like skeletal threads from the ceiling. Yet despite the eerie quiet, he didn't feel threatened. If anything, he felt welcomed, as if the mountain had been waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the passage widened into a chamber illuminated by a beam of sunlight slicing through an opening far above. The light landed directly on a wooden chest, small, old, meticulously carved. His breath hitched. Ethan gasped softly. He approached it slowly, knees weakening with every step. The chest wasn't locked. He lifted the lid and froze. Inside lay objects wrapped in cloth, papers sealed with wax, and a small, framed photograph resting on top. He lifted the photo first, hands trembling. It was his grandmother, holding him as a baby. Beside her was a man he didn't recognize, but the tenderness of the photo made his throat tighten. Beneath the photograph was a letter with his name written in her handwriting, uneven, familiar, fragile. His vision blurred as he opened it. His grandmother's words unfolded like a soft voice in the silent chamber, telling him she always feared the world would break him, that life might strip him bare, but she wanted him to know he came from strength, from resilience, from a love that refused to die. She wrote of regrets, of secrets she wished she had confessed earlier, of a heritage buried beneath the mountain for generations, passed through maps and whispers. She wrote that everything he needed to rebuild his life rested inside this chest. His hands shook harder as he looked inside again. He saw documents, deeds, bank information, keys, more keys than he could make sense of, and beneath them, a metal box that felt surprisingly heavy when he lifted it. His heart pounded as he opened it. He didn't even understand what he was seeing at first. Just stacks of neatly packed bars, small but unmistakable. Gold, real gold, more than he could comprehend, more than he could ever have dreamed. His breath collapsed into a broken whisper. Ethan's eyes widened, confusion flickering across his face. "Dad, what is it?" He swallowed hard, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. "It's a miracle," he managed. But even as the magnitude washed over him, he felt something deeper than wealth. He felt connection, forgiveness. A piece of his identity returned. His grandmother didn't just leave him treasure, she left him a way back to himself, a way forward, a lifeline when he was moments from drowning. Ethan wrapped his small arms around his father's waist, grounding him back to the present. He rested a hand on his son's back, closing his eyes as gratitude surged through him, so powerfully it almost felt like light. He whispered another prayer, this time not desperate, but overflowing. The tunnel, the map, the journey. It all made sense now. And yet he felt, unmistakably, that this was only the beginning. Because treasure was one thing. But understanding why she left it, what story lay behind it, and what they were meant to do next, that journey had only just begun. For a long time, he simply stood there in the half-lit chamber, unable to move, unable to breathe normally, unable to understand how a life that had collapsed so brutally could suddenly shift in an instant. The gold, the deeds, the letters, everything inside that chest seemed almost unreal, like a dream too fragile to touch. Ethan stayed pressed against his side, small fingers gripping the fabric of his jacket, sensing the tremor beneath his father's skin. The boy didn't understand the monetary value, but he understood the weight of the moment. Even at his young age, children always recognized when life took a sudden turn. The father drew a long, unsteady breath and closed the chest gently, his hands lingering on the wood as though trying to absorb whatever strength his grandmother had carved into it. He whispered a soft, "Thank you," to her, to God, to whatever force had guided them here after months of wandering through alleys and shelters and cold sidewalks that had nearly swallowed them both. But the moment of awe soon faded into the soft hum of uncertainty. Treasure was one thing. Survival, understanding, purpose. Those were something else entirely. He lifted the chest carefully, but its weight made his arms strain, so he set it down again and rummaged through the contents for anything portable. He found a smaller pouch packed with several coins and a folded document that appeared to be a withdrawal authorization. It wasn't enough to change their lives immediately, but it was something, a beginning. Ethan tugged on the hem of his sleeve. "Dad, are we rich?" The question was innocent, hopeful, almost scared. He knelt so he could look into his son's eyes that had seen too much hardship already. "I don't know yet," he said truthfully. "But we're not lost anymore, and we're not alone. That's what matters right now." Ethan nodded, accepting the answer with childlike trust. The father squeezed his shoulder gently. Then he lifted the pouch, tied it securely to his belt, and prepared to leave the chamber. Yet as he turned, something at the far end of the cavern caught his attention. A stone pillar rising from the ground, carved with patterns he didn't recognize. He approached slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The carvings were weathered but intentional, swirling lines like flowing water, interspersed with figures that looked vaguely human. One of them resembled his grandmother's silhouette, or maybe that was just his grief and wonder projecting meaning onto the stone. But the most striking part wasn't the pillar. It was the faint glow emanating from beneath it, a soft, warm shimmer, almost like breath. His pulse quickened. He placed a hand on the cool stone and felt a subtle vibration beneath it, like a heartbeat deep within the earth. He didn't know whether to feel comforted or terrified. Before he could explore further, Ethan's voice echoed softly across the chamber. "Dad, I'm a little scared." The father immediately stepped back from the pillar, its mysteries momentarily pushed aside by the more urgent need to comfort his son. He brushed a hand through Ethan's hair. "I know, buddy. I am too. But being scared doesn't mean we're in danger. It just means something big is happening." Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed wide. The father decided they'd gone far enough for now. The tunnel, the carvings, the glow, all of that could wait. They needed daylight, space, time to think, and above all, they needed to get somewhere safe. He lifted the chest one more time, but the weight reminded him that carrying it through the narrow passage would be nearly impossible. Reluctantly, he set it down again and pulled the map from his pocket. There were additional markings he hadn't noticed before, subtle lines branching from the tunnel symbol leading toward an old cabin icon scrawled near the edge of the forest. A cabin, one he vaguely remembered from early childhood visits. It was small, isolated, almost forgotten. Yet now, it appeared to be part of the puzzle. Maybe his grandmother intended for him to find the chest first, then the cabin. Maybe the cabin held the rest of the answers. Maybe it held shelter, tools, resources, something to help him carry what he'd found deep underground. Making a decision, he left the chest hidden in the chamber for now, carefully draping a tarp-like fragment he found inside over it to protect it from moisture. He whispered another promise, to return, to understand, to honor whatever she left for him. Then he guided Ethan back through the winding passage, retracing their steps toward the entrance. The outside world felt overwhelmingly bright after the dim glow of the tunnel, but also refreshing. The wind brushed over them with a sharp autumn bite. Leaves scurried across the valley floor in swirling patterns, as though ushering them onward. They climbed out of the dip and stood beneath the sky again. The father looked at the map, then at the horizon. According to the markings, the cabin lay northeast, tucked somewhere along a ridge covered in birch and pine. The distance looked manageable, maybe a couple of hours' walk, but nothing in the mountains was ever as simple as it appeared. Still, they had no other choice. They pressed forward. As they walked, the forest changed gradually. Pines gave way to slender birches with white bark glowing like frozen fire in the afternoon light. The air smelled sharper, colder, and as they climbed, the wind grew stronger. Ethan grew tired, and the father lifted him onto his back for part of the journey, grateful for the years of manual labor that kept his strength intact despite their hardships. They passed a small stream roaring louder than its size suggested, swollen from recent rains. The boy dipped his fingers in the water and laughed at the coldness, the first genuine laugh his father had heard from him in weeks. The sound hit him unexpectedly hard, like a prayer answered. They continued along the ridge until the trees thinned and the land opened to a sweeping view of the valley below. Nestled against a slope, half hidden behind tall brush and decades of neglect, stood the cabin. Small, weather-beaten, roof sagging slightly, smoke-stained stones forming the chimney. It was humble and lonely, but undeniably real, and somehow it felt like the first warm place he'd seen in years. Ethan held his breath in awe. Did great-grandma live here? The father nodded slowly. A long time ago. Before I was your age. They approached the cabin cautiously. The steps creaked beneath their weight, but the structure held. He pushed the door gently, expecting resistance, but it swung open with a hollow groan. Inside, dust lined every surface. Faded curtains hung like exhausted ghosts. A wooden table sat crooked, one leg shorter than the others. Shelves sagged under the weight of old jars filled with herbs and dried leaves. 2 chairs, a fireplace full of ash, a bed pushed into the corner, quilt still intact but dulled by age. Despite the decay, the cabin felt lived in. Not recently, but lovingly. Ethan stepped inside, timidly, running his finger across a dusty tabletop. It feels like she's still here, he whispered. The father felt it too. The air carried her energy, soft but strong, like the woman he remembered faintly from childhood stories and fleeting visits. He walked deeper into the room and noticed something odd. On the far wall hung a tapestry too bright to belong in a place so old. Its colors, deep blue, crimson, gold, remained vibrant, untouched by dust or time. The fabric depicted mountains, rivers, stars, arranged in a precise pattern. At the center was a symbol matching one carved into the stone pillar in the tunnel. His heart skipped. This couldn't be coincidence. He reached toward the tapestry, and as his fingertips brushed the surface, the fabric shifted slightly, revealing a small metal hook behind it. A hidden compartment? He hooked his fingers behind the tapestry and pulled gently. The fabric lifted easily, exposing a wooden panel set into the wall. It had no handle, but as he pressed his palm against it, it clicked softly and swung inward like a door. Ethan gasped. Behind the panel was a shallow shelf, and on that shelf sat a small wooden box, sealed with twine, and bearing a single symbol burned into its lid, the same symbol as the tunnel carvings. His hands shook again as he reached for it. The box was surprisingly light. He placed it on the table, sat beside it with Ethan close by, and untied the twine. Inside lay several folded pages written in his grandmother's familiar hand, along with an old compass, a metal key, and a single pendant shaped like the symbol they kept seeing. The father unfolded the first page. It wasn't a letter. It was a journal entry. Her words were shaky but thoughtful, filled with a strange mixture of fear and hope. She wrote of the tunnel beneath the mountain, of secrets passed down through generations, of riches intended not for selfish gain, but for healing, rebuilding, restoring what life had broken. She wrote of a promise she made to his late mother, one she intended to fulfill, even if he never understood why. And she wrote about him, her grandson, whom she feared life might wound deeply, the way it wounded her own children. She wrote of praying that God would guide him to this place when the time was right, when he needed it most, when he was ready to rediscover his worth. His vision blurred as he read her final line. If he arrives with a child, let love guide him deeper than fear ever could. He pressed the pages to his chest, overwhelmed. Ethan looked up with wide eyes. She knew we'd come? He nodded, unable to speak. After a long moment, he opened the remaining pages. They revealed a hand-drawn depiction of a larger structure hidden deeper within the mountain. A second chamber, accessible only through a route marked on the map's backside. The first tunnel wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The compass aligned with new markings. The key matched a shape drawn in the margin. The pendant seemed to be both symbolic and practical, possibly a tool or identifier. His grandmother had left him not just treasure, but a path, one that required courage, faith, and understanding. As he sat in the dim cabin, wind rattling the window, dry leaves whispering across the roof, he felt an enormous shift inside his soul. It wasn't the gold that changed him. It wasn't the documents or the key or even the map. It was the realization that his grandmother had never forgotten him, had never stopped loving him, had never stopped believing he might one day need something she alone could give. And God, in his quiet way, had led him exactly where he needed to go. Ethan climbed into his lap, laying his head against his chest. The father wrapped his arms around him tightly, feeling his son's heartbeat against his own. "Dad, are we going to be okay now?" Ethan murmured. The father closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and allowed himself to believe the truth for the first time in years. "Yeah, buddy," he whispered. "I think we will. I think this is the start of something new." But as he held his son and listened to the forest settling into twilight, he felt the weight of the compass and the key in his pocket, and he understood that the journey wasn't over. It was deepening. The mountain held more answers, more secrets, more truth. And now, armed with his grandmother's final guidance, he was ready to face whatever waited in the shadows beneath the earth. Because healing wasn't found in gold or houses or documents. Healing was found in understanding, not where he came from, but who he was meant to become. And tomorrow, he would return to the tunnel. Not as a lost man searching for a miracle, but as a son following the last trail his grandmother left for him. The morning came quietly, with pale light filtering through the brittle cabin curtains and settling softly across the floorboards, as though careful not to disturb the fragile calm that father and son had found overnight. He woke before Ethan, lying still for a moment as the cold air pressed gently against his skin, and the reality of yesterday seeped back into him. The tunnel, the chest, the second map, the journal, the key, the compass, the pendant, the cabin that felt like a spiritual anchor. For the first time in years, he didn't wake to dread. He woke to purpose. He whispered a prayer of gratitude into the stillness, a raw and honest thank you to God for guiding them here, despite the miles of suffering that had nearly broken them both. He turned his head to look at Ethan, curled up in blankets, breathing steadily. The boy's face looked softer in sleep, freed from the constant anxiety that had shadowed him for too long. Seeing him peaceful made the father's chest tighten with emotion. He lay there another few minutes, memorizing the moment, knowing their lives were already changing, yet aware that the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. When Ethan finally stirred, stretching with a small yawn, the father smiled. "Morning, buddy. Are we going back today?" The boy asked instantly, as though he too had dreamt of tunnels and symbols and secrets waiting in the mountain's belly. The father brushed the boy's hair back gently. "Yeah," he said, "but today we're not going in blind. Today we follow her map the way she wanted us to." Ethan nodded deeply, as if accepting a solemn responsibility. They dressed quickly, layering themselves against the biting autumn air. The father packed everything carefully: the map, the compass, the key, the pendant, the journal pages. He wished he could take the entire cabin with him. It felt like a sanctuary, built from his grandmother's love, a place where lost parts of himself had begun to return. Before they left, he walked to the small window and looked over the valley. Something felt different in the air, not ominous, but expectant, as though the mountain itself was aware and waiting. He stepped outside with Ethan, closing the cabin door behind them. They descended the slope and retraced their steps toward the hidden dip in the earth, the map guiding them deeper into the forest. The path was steeper this time, weaving through thickets and over fallen logs. Birds called overhead. Leaves crunched beneath their boots. Stones scraped beneath their palms as they climbed a narrow ledge. Each step felt heavier and yet lighter at the same time. Heavy with anticipation, light with the strange comfort of knowing he was finally walking toward something instead of away from everything. When they reached the dip, the father paused. He lifted Ethan down, took his hand, and together they approached the tunnel entrance. The pendant pulsed faintly against his chest, as though sensing proximity to its intended place. With a deep breath, they walked inside. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, but the father no longer felt afraid. The compass needle quivered in his palm, then steadied, pointing not toward the chamber where the chest waited, but toward a narrow fissure he hadn't explored before. It was small, almost invisible unless one knew to look. His grandmother had known. She'd marked it on the second map. He squeezed Ethan's hand. "Stay close." They entered the fissure. It widened after a few feet into a sloping corridor. Strange patterns emerged on the rock walls, echoes of the same symbol that adorned the tapestry and the pendant. As they walked, the walls seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration pulsing like a distant heartbeat. The mountain felt alive. They reached a fork where the compass spun once before pointing left. He followed the needle, praying silently that he wasn't leading his son into danger. After another long stretch of walking, the corridor suddenly opened into a vast cavern, far larger than the first chamber. The father sucked in a breath. The space was breathtaking. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the rock ceiling high above, scattering beams of pale gold across massive pillars that rose from the ground like the bones of the mountain. Moss glowed faintly on the stones, illuminated by dancing motes of dust. Water trickled from a crevice, forming a small pool that reflected shimmering patterns across the cavern walls. Ethan whispered, "It looks like a church." And he was right. The cavern felt sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a spiritual one, as though generations had walked these paths, carrying burdens, hopes, prayers. They stepped further in, guided by the compass, until they reached a large circular platform at the center of the cavern. In the middle stood a stone pedestal with a narrow indentation shaped exactly like the pendant. The father's pulse quickened. He looked at Ethan, who nodded with wide, trusting eyes. Slowly, he removed the pendant and placed it into the indentation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the platform trembled gently. A soft rumbling echoed through the chamber. The stone pedestal lowered slightly, revealing a hidden mechanism beneath it. A panel at its base slid open with a soft hiss, exposing a compartment filled with several objects. A leather-bound journal wrapped in cloth, a long wooden box, a sealed envelope, and a folded sheet of parchment bearing his grandmother's handwriting. His hands shook as he reached for the parchment first. It read, "If you have come this far, you have already begun to heal. The rest you will understand when you are ready." He exhaled shakily. He opened the journal next. His grandmother had written it in her final years. Page after page told a story he had never known. How she had discovered the tunnels by accident, how she had inherited the secret from her own mother, how the treasure was only the surface of something far deeper. She wrote of a responsibility that weighed on her heart, a responsibility she feared would vanish if her children continued down paths of conflict and distance. She wrote of regret, of pushing her daughter, his mother, too hard, of failing to understand her pain until too late. Tears burned the father's eyes as he read lines that felt like a confession intended for both him and his mother. The journal ended with a plea. "Take what I could not finish. Heal where I could not mend. Protect what I nearly lost." Beneath the journal lay the long wooden box. He hesitated, breathing deeply, then unlatched it. Inside was not treasure, not gold, not jewels. It was a collection of documents, old land agreements, mineral rights, geological surveys, and a deed transferring ownership of the mountain itself. His grandmother had owned the land beneath their feet, the land containing the tunnels, the treasure, and the hidden legacy. She had transferred everything to him. Ethan stared in bewilderment. Dad, what does that mean? The father took a long, steadying breath. It means we're the guardians of this place now, he said softly, awe filling his voice. This mountain, this secret, everything here, it's ours to protect. But there was one more item, the sealed envelope. His grandmother had written his name on it. Hands trembling, he opened it. Inside was a letter, her final words to him. She wrote of her faith, of praying every night that God would guide him even when life pushed him to the edge. She wrote that losing his mother had broken her spirit, and she had feared losing him too. She wrote that the treasure was never meant to make him rich, but to give him a foundation to rebuild his life, to raise his child with dignity, to learn that even the forgotten can be chosen. And then came the line that shattered him completely. You are worth far more than what the world made you believe. If God led you here, it is because you were meant for more than survival. You were meant for restoration. Tears streamed down his face uncontrollably. Ethan hugged him tightly, confused, but sensing his father's emotional avalanche. The father held his son with trembling arms, overwhelmed with gratitude, grief, redemption, and awe all at once. He whispered broken thank yous to God, to his grandmother, to fate, for not abandoning him even when he had abandoned hope. When he finally wiped his face and steadied his breath, he knew something deep in his soul. Their journey wasn't about treasure. It was about healing generational wounds, reclaiming what had been lost, and building something new for Ethan, a legacy built on love, not scarcity. They gathered everything carefully, securing the journal, the deed papers, the key, the pendant, and the map. As they prepared to leave the cavern, the father paused and looked around one last time. Thank you, he whispered into the vast, echoing chamber. The mountain seemed to answer with a soft breath of wind. They walked back through the tunnels, emerging into the crisp autumn air. The valley looked different now, wider, brighter, alive with possibility. From here, their path was new. He would restore the cabin. He would build a life here. He would honor his grandmother's legacy by protecting the land and its secrets. He would create a home where Ethan could grow without fear. And maybe, in time, he would open parts of the tunnels to historians or preservationists, ensuring their cultural and natural significance didn't disappear into darkness. But first, they would eat, rest, and pray. The sun dipped lower as they approached the cabin again, golden light spilling across the mountainsides like a quiet blessing. The father placed his hand on the cabin door and whispered, "We're home." Ethan beamed. "Home," he repeated, like tasting a new word he had always longed to say. And for the first time in a very long time, the father believed it. Not as a hope, but as truth. They stepped inside together, father and son, no longer lost, no longer broken, ready to rebuild a life shaped not by hardship, but by grace, love, and the quiet, steady guidance of a grandmother who had never stopped believing in them.